Hey everybody, this week I want to show you the process I took in rebuilding my first amp from this to this. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm glad you've tuned in again. I want to start this video by reminding you all to subscribe down below and also hit that bell icon so you get all the notifications for my latest videos as soon as they come out. This week I've got a really cool video for you guys. It's something I've had in the vault for a while, and it's the process I took to rebuild my first ever guitar amp. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of video of it, but I took tons of pictures during the rebuild, so I'm hoping you guys will enjoy this video and see all the steps that it takes to go through the rebuild of something like this. A little bit of backstory first. When I was in grade 5, I believe it was, so back in 1995, I purchased my first guitar. I used money that I had saved up from my paper route, and I was able to get a great deal on an HSS Samick Strat copy at a local music store as it was going out of business. I was super pumped to get this guitar, and I couldn't wait to play it because, I had always seen people play electric guitar and always just been fascinated by it. Well, anyway, I got it home and I started playing it, and then I realized quickly that I needed an amp. Unfortunately, when I had just spent all my money on my guitar, I didn't have that extra money for an amplifier. Luckily for me, my parents were the nicest folks in the world at the time. Even though they knew it was going to bring them probably hours of annoyance, they were able to get in touch with a local musician, a friend of the family, who had an old gigging amp, and they purchased that for me so I had something to plug my very first guitar into. So my very first amplifier was a solid state Yamaha G50 112 amplifier. So 50 watts and one 12-inch speaker. Solid state, it had built-in reverb and distortion, the 3-band EQ, it had bright and presence, had a bunch of stuff on it, which I didn't know how to use when I was a kid, but I just thought it was awesome because it would make my guitar louder. Skip ahead to about 7 or 8 years ago when I purchased my first house. I had to clean all the junk out of my parents' house that had been left there, since I had graduated from high school and went off to university. So this amp had come back into my possession. Now, between when I had used this when I was a kid and when I got it back 7 or 8 years ago, I had dabbled with different amps. I had a Roland Microcube. I had actually gone out and bought my first tube amp, which is my Blues Junior that I play a lot of stuff through. And so I knew a little bit about amps at that time, but I had never really looked into this amp that I had owned way back then. And what I found when I looked at it was pleasantly surprising. So the main thing I found with this amp is, I did some research, and basically people were calling it the solid state deluxe reverb. I can't really compare it, but this is the forums I saw, and they said a lot of gigging musicians back in the 80s would have used these as kind of their gigging amp or their second amp, solid state, a little bit more reliable than maybe the tube amps, and it was set up very similar to how the Fender reverbs were at the time. Another cool thing that I found out about this amplifier when I was looking into it, actually looking inside of it, was that it didn't have the one 12-inch Yamaha speaker that was stock. This gigging musician had actually modified this old amplifier to take two 10-inch speakers, and those 10-inch speakers were the Fender JBL speakers with the orange back, and I'll put a picture of those up here. Now, I didn't know a lot about those speakers at the time, but obviously I did some Google searching to see, what kind of quality they were, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that, these are some pretty sought-after speakers. Maybe not so much the 10-inch ones, but definitely the 12-inch ones with the orange back. A lot of people had used these to replace these stock speakers in their Fender reverb. So again, that syncs up with this idea of being the solid state reverb companion that Yamaha had built. So I thought that was really cool, and my thoughts started going off thinking, this would be a fun project to do one day, to actually clean this guy out, check out the electronics, make sure everything was up to snuff, and piece it back together. Skip ahead another 6 or 7 years, I guess, until about a year ago when I decided, I finally getting confident enough with woodworking, and I knew a lot about electronics and stuff at that point as well, that I wanted to rebuild this amplifier. So what I first had to do was evaluate the cabinet it was in pretty rough shape. It had been beaten around quite a bit, not so much by me, but by the original musician who had it. It had taken probably some water on as well. It was in my parents' crawl space for a while, so I think the humidity had got to it, and it was really heavy, like way heavier than it should have been. So I think there was a lot of moisture in the wood in the cabinet. So I wanted to rebuild that, and I thought, you know, I can do this. I've done some woodworking before, so it shouldn't be that bad. Also, I was able to track down the schematic for the electronics inside, which was a little bit tough. I went to the depths of Google to find this information, but equipped with that, you know, my knowledge of electronics and my background, I started pulling this amp apart and looking at both the external and what I could do with the, you know, the outside, how it looked, the cabinet, the faceplate, stuff like that, and then maybe what I could fix with some of the internal components. I'd used this for quite a while. I'd broken the shafts off some of the pots. The distortion didn't work anymore, which I didn't know why. And although it said it had reverb, I don't know if the reverb ever worked on this. So a couple things I wanted to investigate, and I think I'm going to take you through most of that right now. So the first thing I had to do was you know, start tearing down this amplifier. I had decided that I was going to rebuild the cabinet, so you know, I needed to get everything out of there, set it aside so I could, you know, measure the cabinet up and make sure I had all the right dimensions. This started by removing the back panel. Then I had to unhook the dual speakers there and pull out the actual amplifier or the electronics for the amplifier. That was no issue. I noticed a few things right off. The first of which was the amplifier was just full of dust. There was, you know, big mothballs in it, so I had to vacuum that all out. Did a little bit of electronics cleanup on the electronics board, so that was just quick stuff that I probably should have done along the way anyway without ever having to, you know, rebuild an amplifier. Once I got the amplifier electronics out, I set those off to the side. I wanted to begin with my build of my cabinet, so I had decided to go with just a straight pine cabinet. It was you know, 1x12 board. I had cut it to the same dimensions as the original cabinet, which was, you know, obviously made sense. Everything would fit back in perfectly. So I wanted to, you know, do something really easy. The way I attached them together was just butt end joints. So if you're familiar with woodworking, I didn't use finger joints. I just butted them up. I used wood glue to keep them together with some finishing nails to hold them while the glue set. This is going to be stronger than screws, just from my own experience, so I'm very happy using glue here with the nails as a kicker. So after I got the, you know, the 4 pieces for the exterior of the cabinet done, I had to sand it all. I used 150 grit, I think maybe some 222, but that would have been overkill just because I was going to Tolex this anyway. Had to fill in some gaps with some wood filler, especially where that angled piece meets the top of the amp. If you're familiar with any kind of deluxe reverb, they have that little angled piece kind of cut the corner off at the front top of the amp. So I had to do some sanding in there. Yeah, so pretty straightforward to build that. I used a half over router bit to route the outside of the edges to just make sure everything looked clean, and it gives it that same look as a Fender Reverb or, you know, that original Yamaha cabinet. The next thing I had to do was just create a face on the inside of the cabinet so I could screw in the baffle that held my 2 speakers. This one was a little bit of an upgrade over the old baffle or the old face because you know, someone had just hacked it away with a jigsaw, and you know, the 2 speakers that they had put in place actually weren't open to air. There were, you know, some of the baffle was actually closed off in front of it, so a little bit of an upgrade on the cabinet. Probably not much of a difference, but you know, something I definitely took note of when I was building this cabinet out. Once I got the face glued in and a couple of extra support structures in there, I had built the shelf where the amplifier could sit as well. I got to probably the most worrisome step of rebuilding this speaker, which was Tolexing it. I had sourced some Tolex from, I think it was Next Gen Guitars here in Canada. I wanted to do something a little bit different than the black Tolex and the gray grill that came with the stock Yamaha amp, so I went with a not Sonic Blue, it was Seafoam Green Tolex. and a wheat grill. So kind of cool look. I had some ideas what I was going to do with the faceplate at that point too, so I thought it would work really well. So when Tolexing your amplifier, for me, I just use this stuff here. This is LePage heavy duty contact cement. It worked really well. I would definitely recommend doing it in a well ventilated location. The way it goes on is you will just cut all your pieces of Tolex to length. So you should be doing that before you glue anything. Make sure you have mocked up all the lines you can draw on your cabinet to make sure you have the right distances, etc. with your Tolex. You want to have all those cut out, and then you're going to piece by piece put the cutout Tolex on with the contact cement. The way to do that is you just brush it on. I used a paintbrush. So I brushed on my contact cement, a pretty healthy layer of it. You let it sit for a couple minutes just where it starts to get a little bit tacky. And then once it gets to be a little bit tacky, you're going to press your Tolex down on it. And the way I did it was I kind of started at the top and then continually rolled it down and pressed as I went down. It gives a firm seal pretty much everywhere. If you do run into some spots where there is a corner that might be sitting up a little bit, or something that is the edge of it isn't sticking down, I would recommend using super glue and then just holding it there for a minute or so, and those edges will stick. So the big thing about Tolexing is doing the corners properly. I looked at some of the amps that I had and saw how they did the corners. I also mocked it up with just a piece of loose leaf so I could understand the cuts I would have to make, the 45s I'd have to make to get those proper corners. And I think I did a pretty good job for the first time through building an amplifier. I'm going to put some pictures up here. Obviously, you might be seeing them now. But if you really take your time, like I said, I used a piece of loose leaf and pretended it was Tolex and just tried a couple different ways to cut it, and then used that as a template for cutting my Tolex, and I thought it worked really well. Again, you might get some little spots that stick up in the corners, maybe some little pieces that don't quite meet when you cut your 45s. I found that if you just use a little bit of pressure and some super glue, you can push those together and stick them down pretty close. Wrapping the wheat grill really wasn't that much. I just built a small frame out of some strips of wood that I had. I used a staple gun to staple the wheat grill onto the frame, and then I used Velcro from the baffle to my grill in 3 or 4 places so I could move that, take that on and off as needed. So the inside of the amplifier was a little bit of a different task. This is more electronics than woodworking, but it was still pretty fun. The first thing I said was actually just cleaning up the board. So getting rid of all the dust with a vacuum cleaner, cleaning up the electronics boards with some electronics cleaner, just making sure you didn't have any dust or anything going on in there. The steps I took inside this board, the first thing was to remove the old neon lamp that was in there. I wanted to replace it with a more modern jewel style lamp. Now I still kept a neon light bulb, but I rewired it so I had the the T 3 1/4 bulb that is common on all your Fender amps. Mind you, this is rated for the 120 volt AC bulb rather than the 6.3 volt DC bulb that's on your Fender amp. So a little bit different, but same style overall. I also replaced all the switches, all the input jacks. So my on-off switch, my input-output jack, and I did have 1 or 2 broken potentiometers. So the shafts had been broken on I think my treble in my middle. I replaced those with some CTS pots that I had purchased from Next Gen Guitars as well. So at this point I was feeling pretty good. There was only a few other things I wanted to look into. The first thing I noticed when I pulled the board out was that it had a hardwired fuse, which I thought was really weird. So that was a simple change. I just bought a fuse socket, I guess you would call it, and soldered that in place of this. So if a fuse ever did break, I didn't have to actually solder to a fuse, which to me, I don't really know how they did that back then. I would have thought that the heat would have broken the fuse. But yeah, that was something really easy to do, and it definitely makes it a little bit more, I guess, user-friendly for an electrician down the road. The other thing I wanted to look at was my distortion. Like I said, I really wasn't getting any distortion with it. I used my schematic, I back traced the circuit and found the distortion really came down to 2 diodes that were pointing to ground. Inspected those diodes and one of them was burnt out, so no diodes, it's not going to distort like you want it to. I replaced the 2 diodes. When I got it back together, the distortion was working much better than it ever did, and I was super happy. So the next thing I looked at was my reverb. As I mentioned, I was never able to get much reverb out of this amplifier, so I wanted to see what was going on with it. It was interesting to see that the reverb tank here was an Accutronics 1A, which is a really short latency reverb tank. It was soldered directly to the board, so it didn't have the RCA hot swappable plugs. I quickly changed that, put in some plugs and jacks for the RCA hot swappable reverb tanks. I looked at the existing tank that was in there when I peeled it off. Normally, if you know anything about reverb tanks, there's 2 or 3 springs in it depending on what kind of latency you want or how heavy the effect is. This had, I think was originally a 2-spring reverb tank. There was 1 spring that was broken off inside of it, and the other one looked like it was rusted all the way out. So I guess I was right saying that there was probably some moisture that had gotten into this, and I suspected that's why I never got my reverb. I replaced the reverb tank with a Accutronics 3A reverb tank, I think it was. 3 meaning that it was just the longest latency that Accutronics had put out. It was 3 springs as opposed to the 2 springs that was in there, so I was looking for really a huge bump in reverb on this one. Finally, I wanted to do something with the faceplate. This had an old metal faceplate. A lot of it had been scratched off, even the faceplate was bent, so I wanted to figure out a cheap and easy way to upgrade the look of the front of the amplifier. The first thing I did was, replace all the knobs on there. I had placed white chicken head knobs on. I think it gave a really cool look to go along with, all the new hardware that was in there for the, the jacks and the switch as well. So none of that rusted chrome stuff. And finally, I was able to come up with an idea for creating a new faceplate. This is just a sticker that I had created in paint.net, similar to how I do my pedal graphics. I was able to get this the exact size I wanted through, I think it was called Sticker Mule online. I'd order 5 of them, but it was still, I think, only 10 bucks. This is, kind of my own take on the nameplate. And what I did is I just stuck this to a piece of plexiglass and drilled out the holes on my drill press, and boom, I had a new faceplate. There was never wrinkling in the sticker, which was really good. It looks great, really, and you'll see that in a bit here. So talked about the cabinet, talked about the Tolexing, talked about the electronics inside. Last thing to talk about was the speakers. They were actually in really good shape. There was a little dent in one of the cups on one of the 10-inch speakers. I did the old shop vac trick to pull that dent out. Didn't break anything, didn't rip anything in the cup, so I was quite happy with that. And tested them out. Everything seemed to be working fine. I didn't muck around with how they had went from a 112 to a 210 or the impedance matching there. It looked like everything was proper, but I will defer to the original person who had set this up and used it for years and years and years without blowing it up. So I was good to go there. So without further ado, I want to show you guys this amp, show you what it can do. It's a reverb machine now. It's got great distortion. It goes great with, my new Jazzmaster or any real guitar. I like using it for, really kind of distorted stuff. I think that's usually where my thought goes when I go to solid state amps anyway. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoy it, and hopefully you guys like the pictures I put up there to show you the whole process I went through in rebuilding this guitar amplifier. So that's it for me this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe, hit the notifications bell, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.